Mouse techniques are something that you need to get used to if you're going to spend any time whatsoever using a personal computer. And I know that if you're not used to it, it can take a little bit of practice in order to get good and efficient with it, because it does require a little bit of hand and eye coordination. So I don't want anybody to feel bad if at first you feel a little clumsy working with the mouse. You just have to trust me when I say that if you practice just a little bit, pretty soon you'll be mousing away like it was nothing. So let's talk about a few of these different skills as well as the parts of the mouse so you understand what the terminology is and what you actually do with the mouse itself. First of all, we'll talk about moving the cursor. With a regular mouse, you move the cursor by physically moving the mouse with your hand in the desired direction. So as you're looking at the screen, actually put your hand down on the mouse, make it comfortable, and then you're simply going to move the mouse using your elbow and your shoulder. If you run out of room on your desktop or on your mouse pad, it's okay to pick up the mouse and actually put it back so that you have more room to move in the direction you need to. If you're using a trackball, the thought is the same, except remember that with a trackball, you never physically move the trackball itself, meaning the whole thing. What you do is you simply roll the ball with your finger. Depending on which version you have, you're either going to move it with your thumb or probably your index or your middle finger. Rolling the ball is similar to physically moving the mouse with a typical mouse. If you have a touchpad or a touch screen, you're going to drag your finger on the pad in the direction you want to move. So if I wanted to move the cursor from the lower left corner to the upper right corner, I would place my finger on the pad, and with my finger still touching the pad, I would physically drag my finger from the lower left to the upper right corner. Again, if you need to reorient or you run out of room, it's okay to pick your finger up and move it back down or up in the direction that you need to. And if you have that eraser head on your laptop, you're just going to pivot it by pushing it in the direction that you want it to go. So again, if the cursor is currently in the lower left part of the screen and you want to move to the upper right, you would put your finger on the very top of the eraser head and simply push it up and to the right. If you're using graphics tablets or some other mobile devices that might let you use a stylus, then you're going to touch the stylus to the pad or the screen and drag it in the desired direction, very similar to a touchpad and a touchscreen. Moving the cursor is probably one of the most basic and fundamental things that you will need to learn on a computer. Regardless of which type of mouse or pointing device you use, this is really a critical skill. So if it's not very familiar to you, just take some time to practice. After we move the cursor, then we can start talking about those buttons and wheels. As I said before, almost every mouse, whether it's a mouse, a trackball, a touchpad, or any of those, is going to have some type of a button, usually a left or primary and a right or secondary. The left button is going to select things, and the right button is always going to display a shortcut menu. And we'll take a look at that shortcut menu when we actually show you some things on the Windows 7 desktop. Most mice these days also have something called a scroll wheel. Now I want to just tell you that if you're using a touchpad on a laptop, for example, it of course doesn't have a wheel, a physical wheel that sticks up, but usually the right edge of the touchpad has a scrolling capability. What that means is if you actually have a wheel on the mouse, you're going to roll that backwards and forwards. If you have a touchpad, you're going to place your finger on the far right side of the pad and simply drag your finger up and down the right edge. You also might have a tilt wheel. Now you won't have this on a touchpad, but it might be on a regular mouse. This is actually something that instead of just going forward and back, goes left and right. The scroll wheel scrolls the screen up and down, so if you're reading a multi-page document, you can scroll through it very easily. And the tilt wheel scrolls the screen left to right, so if your entire document, for example, doesn't fit horizontally on the screen, you can scroll left and right to see the different edges. Let's take a look at what some of this is. Here we can see a mouse with the left and right mouse buttons identified for you. I think that one's pretty basic. Now let's talk about that scroll wheel. Here we have a scroll wheel right in the middle, and if you were going to use that scroll wheel, you would simply roll it backwards and forwards. This would scroll your screen up and down. If your mouse also has tilt capabilities, it's going to look the same. But in this case, that scroll wheel not only moves up and down, it also moves left and right. And by tilting it left and right, you'll scroll horizontally on your screen. Hopefully these illustrations will make it a little bit easier to understand what we actually want to do once we get onto the computer screen itself. After we get beyond how to move the cursor, how to click the buttons, and how to use a scroll wheel, then we need to know about clicking and dragging. To click is to simply press a mouse button. We will do a lot of single clicking, which just means press and release the button. You also will need to do some double clicking, and double clicking means to click the button twice in a row, quickly, without pausing in between. Usually you only double click with the left mouse button. You don't usually double click the right button. It's important to remember with a double click that you want to do it fairly quickly, and I'm going to show you how to adjust the mouse, so if you can't do it very quickly, you'll still be able to let the computer know what a double click is. The reason I say that is if you don't double click quickly enough, the computer interprets it as 2 single clicks, and when we get on screen we'll show you why that can be a problem. Then we get to one of my favorite concepts, which is called drag and drop, or sometimes called click and drag. They're both the same thing. This means that you actually want to press and hold the left mouse button, and while you're holding that left mouse button down, you're going to physically move the mouse. Once you get the mouse where you want it to go, then you release the button. So you're going to select something, you're going to drag it to a new location, and then by releasing the mouse button, you will drop it, which is why they call it drag and drop or click and drag. These are all very basic mousing techniques, but we want to make sure that you're very comfortable with them because you will use them virtually everywhere on a computer these days. So let's take a few minutes to actually take a look at how we might utilize clicking, dragging, dropping, left clicks, right clicks, and all those other things. I have booted up my computer and I'm simply sitting at the Windows desktop. Doesn't matter which version of Windows you have, even though it may look a little bit different, all of these things we're going to do will work the same way. The first thing we know about a mouse is that at its most fundamental, it moves the cursor. If I move my mouse physically from the left and to the right, that moves the cursor left and right as well. What's not always as intuitive is that if you push the mouse away or up on the screen, and if you pull it towards you, it moves the cursor down on the screen. If these things aren't very comfortable for you or they aren't very familiar, you can just practice. It's okay to sit there and just move the mouse around. Also realize that there are some settings for the mouse that can make a mouse, say at work a little bit differently than they might at home. It's called sensitivity, and you can adjust how a little movement of your mouse could make it move a big distance on the screen. We'll talk about settings though in the next lesson. Let's move on with some of our basic mousing techniques. One of those is the use of the left and right mouse buttons. On my desktop, and mine happens to be in the upper left corner of the desktop, I can see a folder called Project Files PC Fundamentals. I'm going to move my mouse to the upper left corner by simply pushing it up and to the left, and you'll notice that as I move my mouse over this folder, it highlights. Later operating systems have this feature enabled, so it makes it easier to see where your mouse actually is. At this point, if I left click with my mouse, I select. Now it had a little bit change of color, but it's easier to see that if I move my mouse completely off of the folder. Even though my mouse is off of the folder, it's still highlighted. That means the folder is selected. One of my favorite sayings on computers, and you'll probably hear me say it several times throughout this course, is, in order to be affected, it must be selected. In other words, in order to do something with this folder, I have to tell the computer that that's what I want it to work with. By left clicking, I have selected it. Now I also told you that a right click always brings up a menu, so I'm going to move back over the folder and press my right mouse button one time. The right mouse button always brings up something called a shortcut menu. Actually, it's called a context-sensitive shortcut menu. Context-sensitive means that it depends on what you right-click on as to what options you see. Since I right-clicked on a folder, I can see things that are appropriate for a folder. If I were to right-click on something else, like a word in a document, I would see different options. This is actually good because it means whenever you right-click, you're only going to see things that are appropriate for what you're trying to work with, not everything the computer can do. So left-click selects, right-click shows a menu, and if I want to deselect this menu, I can just move off of it and do a left-click, and you'll see that I both got rid of the menu and I also deselected the folder. One of my favorite techniques that we've discussed though is that drag and drop, and I'm going to show you how to do that here. Drag and drop is usually used to move something. If I want to drag and drop this folder, I can do so, and that will actually physically move it on the desktop. So maybe I don't like it on the upper left. I want to move it to the lower left. I'm going to move over my mouse, press and hold my left mouse button, and while I'm still holding my left mouse button, I'm going to begin to drag down. And Windows is very good about giving you kind of a shaded image so you can see where you're actually dragging to. And when I get that folder to the location I want, I'm now going to release my left mouse button. I just did a drag and drop by dragging the folder from the upper left to the lower left corner. You also can see that this folder is still selected, which is just fine. Just for practice, I'm going to go ahead and drag it back up on my screen. And as you get some more practice, you'll see that dragging and dropping becomes a very simple technique for you to use, in this case for moving a folder to different locations on the desktop. What I want to do now is to show you the difference between a true double click and what the computer perceives to be a click-pause click. I'm going to left click on the desktop to deselect my folder. Now when I move over the folder, I'm actually going to move over the text itself that says Project Files PC Fundamentals. I'm going to click my mouse once, pause for just half a second, and then click a second time. So here we go. Click, pause, and a click again. What you can see that happened is it now has highlighted the name of my folder. That's the problem that you may have if your double click is too slow for the computer. I'm going to show you how to adjust your double click speed in the next lesson. But for now I want to give you just a hint. If you tend to try to double click on the file name or folder name, you might get into this issue. Right now it's waiting for you to give it a new name, and that's not what we want to do. So I'm going to click off of it to deselect. One way to avoid that is to double click fast enough that it doesn't misinterpret it. But here's a kind of a better way. If you always double click on the icon and not on the text itself, then that will never be an issue because you can only get into that edit mode if you double click on the text. So let's double click on the folder itself. Double clicking actually opens, or launches in this case, a folder. And we'll talk more about folders and files and opening and all of those things in a different chapter. But for now I want you to notice that there is a file in here called Mouse and Keyboard Skills. I'm going to double click on this, and again double clicking is going to actually open this file. The reason I want you to see this is because I want you to see that the things we've been doing, like clicking and dragging, double clicking and right clicking, are different depending on where you're actually doing it. In this case, we're in a text document. If I press and hold my left mouse button and drag across the title, this is not quite dragging and dropping, this is clicking and dragging. And the difference is I didn't move something, but I selected something. So while click and drag and drop are the same physical process with your mouse, by pressing and holding the left mouse button and moving the mouse in a certain direction, they accomplish different things. On the desktop, I did a drag and drop to move the folder, and in a text document, I click and drag to select text. Likewise, I can double click a word in a text document. When you double click in a text document, it selects the entire word. Now I could have done that by clicking and dragging as well, but it was much easier, much more efficient, and much more accurate to just double click and let the computer select the word for me. Again, double clicking on a folder or file opens it, double clicking on a word selects it. Likewise, if I right click on this word, I see a very different menu than when I right clicked on my folder. The right click of my folder gave me a whole list of things that I could do. Right clicking on a word gives me a shorter list. Basically, it's telling me that my only options for this particular selection are to cut, copy, paste, or work with paragraph and lists. This is because when I double clicked on the file, it opened the document in WordPad. If your document opened in another program, say Notepad or Microsoft Word, you might see different options, because the right click depends on two things. It depends on what you clicked on and also what program you're in. That's basically what I wanted to show you, just that using the same mousing techniques or the mousing skills may do different things in different locations. Let's move to the upper right side of this window, and you should see a red X. Give that a single left click to close this document. And we can also do a single left click on the red X for the folder to close it down. This will move us back to the desktop. The one last thing I want to do is show you how to use that scroll wheel. You should see on the lower left corner of your screen, next to your Start button, an E for Internet Explorer. If you see that, you can give that a click. If you don't, you can click on your Start button, and at the top of this menu, you might also see the same icon that says Internet Explorer. If you don't see either one of those, try typing Internet. And if Internet Explorer is highlighted at the top, you can either click on it or press Enter. Internet Explorer opens to what is known as the home page, which in my case happens to be the MSN website. I'm obligated to say that Total Training is neither approving, agreeing with, or endorsing anything that is shown on this site. We're only showing it here for illustrative purposes and not the actual content. The reason I want to bring you here is to show you the scroll wheel on the mouse. To use a scroll wheel, you need to have something that takes up more than one screen, and this web page meets those needs. I'm now going to use the scroll wheel, and I'm going to roll it towards me. And what we will see is that in doing so, it actually scrolls the page for me. I'll left-click on the window one time just to make sure that it's active. Then I'll move the wheel towards me, and you can see that it scrolls down. And if I roll the wheel away from me or up on the mouse, it scrolls the page up. This is useful not only for web pages, but also, as I've said before, for long documents. Let's go ahead and close out this window by moving to the upper right corner, clicking on the red X, which gets us back to our desktop. So the mouse, of course, has very fundamental techniques: clicking, clicking and dragging, double-clicking, right-clicking, and using the scroll wheel. Practice those techniques if you need to, because you'll be using them in virtually every place that you work on your computer. The next thing that we can do, though, is we can show you how to adjust the mouse settings. So if it's frustrating because you can't get yourself to double-click fast enough, at least we can make the mouse work for you instead of against you. Now, I know we haven't yet gotten into the entire Windows desktop and how to set up all the settings for Windows itself, but since we're talking about the mouse, and we've specifically talked about how frustrating it can be if you can't double-click fast enough, I do want to talk about how to change your mouse settings. For this particular section, just kind of follow along, and I promise that in a later chapter we'll go into more detail about exactly what it is we're doing here. For now, I just want to show you what the options are. So I want you to move down to your Start button, which is on the lower left side of the screen, and give that a click. If you're on Windows Vista or Windows 7, simply type the word mouse. If you're on Windows XP, you'll move to the right side, click Control Panel, and then click Mouse Settings. I'll go ahead and press Enter to select the mouse, and what you will see is that you get a dialog box, or a window. The exact options that you see here will depend on the brand, make, and model of the mouse that you have. For example, a trackball may have different settings than a graphics tablet. But some of the basics will still be the same, so let's take a look at what those are. If you happen to be left-handed and you use the mouse on the other side of the keyboard, usually on the left side, then you may want to change the primary key. We always talk about a left click as selecting, but if you're left-handed and using the mouse with your left hand, then your primary key would actually be the one for your index finger, which would be the right mouse button. Now, I know that can be confusing, but if you look at the little picture here in the dialog box, right now the primary button is the left button on the mouse. If I click this checkbox, it changes the primary to the right button. Now, here's the tricky part. Once you check this box, if you then try to left click to turn it off, it's not going to work because it's already changed the button. So I actually have to right click, which is the same as my primary click, to turn it off. In other words, if you try to turn this feature off and you can't, try using the other button on your mouse. Probably the most important thing that we can change with these particular settings, though, is our double click speed. It can be very frustrating if you're trying to double click and you've practiced and you're trying your hardest and you just can't do it fast enough, because you end up with that click, pause, click instead of what should be a double click. Here's how you test it. You move over this little picture, and it might be a folder, it might be a couple of different things, again, depending on your mouse and your operating system. But if you double click, and it changes, in this case, my folder opens and closes as I double click, that means your double click speed is set to OK. Now I'm going to show you if I move this slider by clicking and dragging it all the way to fast. I'm a pretty quick double clicker, so that still works for me. But if I wasn't, and if I tried to do click, click, you can see that doesn't do it. However, if I move this all the way to the left, and then I do click, click, that actually is slow enough that click, click is considered a double click. This is something that you really need to play with. Usually you'll start off with it a little bit in the middle. But if you find that you're not able to double click fast enough, move it over to the slower side. If you find that what you're trying to do is click, pause, click, but Windows still interprets it as a double click, then you would move it farther to the right. I'm not going to go over all of these options, but I did want to show you changing the primary button as well as the double click speed. At the top, we also have a tab for pointers. You can see that the very first one is called Normal Select, and this is the white arrow we're used to seeing very often as we work with Windows. I don't recommend that you change this. Now you can get very creative and you can put little horses and snakes and all kinds of different things as your pointer, but an arrow is very distinct. You know where the point of that arrow is, so I don't recommend that you change that. If you want to change one, then you might consider changing the busy icon. For this particular version of Windows, it's that little spinning donut that we've talked about. For older versions, it may just be the hourglass that flips up and down. In order to change a cursor, you select the type of cursor you want, then you click on the Browse button. This will bring up your cursors folder, and you can scroll through and find any cursor that you would like to use. The primary difference is the size. You have small, medium, and large, and it also can be coloration differences. For example, a black arrow instead of a white arrow. Some people need to change these simply because they have a hard time seeing a certain cursor. Some of them are also animated, and you can choose one that's kind of fun, like a horse that's running or a snake that's kind of hissing at you, those kinds of things. By selecting it and then opening it, you can adjust it. Again, a little bit beyond what we want to do here, so I'm going to click Cancel to get out of that, and just let you know that you can change cursors if that's something you want to do. The next tab that we have are pointer options. Now this is where we get into how fast that pointer moves. If it moves too fast and you're always overshooting what you're looking for, you can come in and you can make it a little bit slower so that the pointer actually moves slower across the screen. There also may be a checkbox called Snap To, so that when a window opens, the pointer will automatically move to the default button. In this box, for example, it would have automatically moved down over the OK button. That simply means that you don't have to move your mouse quite as much because you'll usually be selecting the default button. If you like to see your mouse a little bit better, you can display pointer trails, and now I will show you how that looks on the screen. It kind of has an interesting effect, but I personally think it gets to be a little bit annoying, so I don't turn that one on. Hiding the pointer while typing will simply allow you to get it out of the way. Again, I don't like that either because sometimes I lose my cursor if it disappears, so I just like to keep it on the screen. I'm going to turn that off. And the last option that I do like is show the location of the pointer when I press the Control key. So let me check that and show you how this works as well. If I ever lose my cursor on the screen, and I don't really want to have to move my mouse in order to try to see it, I can use this feature. With it, if I press the Control key on my keyboard, I can more easily see the cursor location because doing so puts a little target around it. So that makes it easier to find. I'm going to leave that enabled for now. And I'm going to go up and talk about the last tab that we need to, which is the wheel. Now obviously you won't have a wheel tab unless you have a wheel on your mouse. But if you do, this adjusts how much it scrolls up and down when you roll it forward and backwards, either a certain number of lines at a time, or you can have it move an entire screen at a time. And if you have the tilt wheel, the same thing happens. You can move a certain number of characters left and right. So this is just adjusting kind of how sensitive the scroll and tilt wheel are. Buttons, pointers, pointer options in the wheel are something that you probably want to come in and take a look at. If you're new at using the mouse, you may set it a certain way when you begin, but then as you get more proficient, you might want to come in and change it a little bit. Out of all of these, probably the most important, I think, is setting up that double-click speed, because I know that new mouse users can become very frustrated trying to double-click when it's set too fast. When you're all finished, you simply click OK, and all of those new mouse settings will be ready for you.